If you will open to Esther chapter 3, third chapter of the book of Esther. We're going to continue our two-part lesson. As we mentioned last week, as we began this, as we focused on having one standard in particular, as we move forward, we're thinking about what does it mean to be a Christian in a world that is full of darkness. And frankly, Esther is an interesting story for that because as you look at her, she is not a great person by almost any count, certainly in chapter 2 and perhaps into chapter 3. It's a little harder to track where she's at in her development. And sometimes when you talk with people about this, they get frustrated. They say, Esther is a hero. She's brave and she's bold, and she was just stuck. And a lot of that's true depending on where in the story you've read. But as of chapter 2, she, as we covered last week, is not really the most devout child of God there's ever been. And that was a bit unfair to end the story there. But because of what we talked about with the elders as being a Christian living in a world full of darkness, we stopped there to see why would someone be tempted to give in when they know better, when their faith should be strong. But today is a little different and a little less theoretical and a little more practical on what does it mean to have a different standard? And what does it mean that I am called to be and supposed to be different? And now we're going to read, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story when it comes to Esther. Now in chapter 3, we're going to just kind of highlight that for a moment. In Esther 3, Haman is on the scene. And of course, Haman is one of the Bible's biggest bad guys, you might say. He has it out for Mordecai, who is, by many counts, Esther's father of sorts. And he's going to kill him. And he extends that eventually to he's going to come after all of the Jews. And so you have Haman, who is this high-ranking official who has it out for Esther's people. But what was one of the dilemmas for Esther in chapter 2? I'm not going to tell anybody that I am a Jew. And so the king doesn't know, the office doesn't seem to know, the whole kingdom does not seem to know Esther's secret. She pointedly kept it private. And she did that multiple times at Mordecai's urging. And so how do we get from the way to where Esther is this person hiding who she is, to Haman is coming for God's people, and then all of a sudden we remember Esther as this person taking this brave, bold stand? How does that happen? Well, first of all, it starts with a challenge. Notice me in verse 4 of Esther chapter 4. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay in the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. In verse 11, verse 10, Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And so we remember our brave Queen Esther is not so brave at the moment. And this isn't about character assassination. This is about understanding, by the way, when it pertains to the book of Esther, that God can use me. God can use you, anyone, lowly, messed up, not inclined to do the right thing. And he can use us to do great things if we will let go of our selfishness and let God's will be done through us. But again, that's the end of the story. Here we have Esther, and her first answer, God's people are in trouble. You can save them. You're the queen. And she goes, no, not me. Because what's the rule? The rule is there is a law. And by the way, we do this with the divorce and remarriage law all the time. There's a difference in the exception and a law. The law is if you approach the king unsummoned, you die. That's the law. Now, there is an exception that he could hold out the scepter and you could live. That really seems like a really risky proposition to have a conversation, doesn't it? The law is you approach the king, you die. Can we understand maybe a little bit more where Esther's coming from, being a little reluctant to stand before the king? Absolutely. But was she still necessary? Yes, to the story as we know it. She needed to have that faith and boldness to go before the throne. But before we talk about that, let's remember last week's example about King Xerxes, Ahasuerus, as he's known in the book of Esther in the Hebrew writings. Xerxes was the king who was so egotistical that when the river waters, you remember this, wiped away the bridge his soldiers were building, he was angry that the water defied him. And this king ordered that the water be whipped 99 times because the water dared defy the great king. That's the guy who has the law that if you come before me unsummoned, you die. Isn't that a bit more of a stark picture? How would Esther be convinced? We know she's going to be challenged. She's been asked to do this. That she's in this special place for this special moment, as we're going to read in a moment. But notice her psychology as she is evolving. What was it that convinced her to say, you know what, it's worth it. I need to do this. Verse 12. They told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Now, you meet some people in life, and they're very, all right, if I'll do this, then you need to do that. Esther hears that she needs to go before the king, and she said, okay, well, you can't eat or drink for 3 days. Is that some sort of tit-for-tat problem? No. She wants God's blessings to be on her because she realizes the magnitude of what she has decided at this moment to do. But what got her to that moment? It was Mordecai standing up. Now, we think of Esther as the hero, and she is. And a lot of times we think of Mordecai as this great, venerable person. And he was the one telling her in chapter 2 repeatedly not to tell anyone who she was, and all that came with that deception. And so he can be flawed too. But in this case, he's very wise. Notice his argument is twofold in verse 13. Number one, you are not going to escape this. Do not think that you will get away from this just because you're in the king's palace. It will come for you. You can try to pretend like this doesn't involve you. You can act like it's not my problem, but it is. Because you're one of God's children, this makes it your problem. And specifically, if you do not help, what's going to happen? You and your father's house will perish. Pretty interesting phrase, by the way, for someone whose father had already died. So this would be something that would mean a lot to Esther. Then in verse 14, the second argument, if you keep silent, relief and deliverance will come from another place. I think this is one of the most difficult parts of this to grasp for myself, just to be honest. It's, okay, well, if she didn't stand up, God could, of course, still save his people, but it has to be Esther, right? Because God wanted Esther, and if she didn't, I don't understand how God would have a plan B, or if his plan B would actually be plan A, and I just think it's plan B. But what I do know for sure is the next phrase is what impacts this text. Who knows whether you have not come in the kingdom for such a time as this? Translation, you are here around these people at this moment in time for a specific purpose. And the question isn't, can God use you? It's, will you let him? Will you be different? Will you be bold in a world that wants you to sit down and to be quiet? Will you stand up and approach the king? What would she do? Of course, she said she's going to. And in chapter 5, she does. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. In front of the king's quarter, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared, and as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Esther answered, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king said. And our study this morning isn't about the story of Esther, but notice that she does approach the king. And husband of the year that he was, he didn't kill her for doing that. So good news there. Her faith made her well. Her husband didn't kill her. Happy ending. But she doesn't go right for the request. She's strategic on this. She tells the king, I want to honor Haman, and of course you as king. And we're going to have this great feast. And notice, what did they do? They were drinking. And the king repeats his request, I'll give you anything up to half of the kingdom. We've heard that before. And it didn't end well for the queen the first time. But then she demurs a second time, and she says, we're going to do this again, and this time she steps up and takes her moment. Notice in chapter 7 and verse 1. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, what is your wish? Queen Esther, it shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. She explains in chapter 8, especially verse 3 and 4, what this plan is. And of course, Haman, who devised all of this good standing for himself and the gallows to be for his enemy Mordecai, who would dare not bow down and worship his greatness, he dies because of his selfishness and his sin. Queen Esther has saved the day. And this is just a beautiful story of how God can use anyone. And then if we think about it and we trust God, if there's fasting and we have people there to point us towards the right way, we can do it. Isn't that a beautiful picture of the story of Esther? Certainly without mentioning God's name, shows God's influence all throughout the book. So our question isn't, how did Esther take a brave stand? That's certainly worth reading and studying time and again. My question is, how do we boldly take stands for God today? When we think about this, our question has to come down to one simple answer. I need to do what's right, no matter what's going on around me. Esther had to do what's right, despite the law was, you approach the king, you die. I need to speak with kindness, no matter how everyone around me is found to be speaking. Notice in Romans chapter 12, this summarizes the difference. What does it mean? Certainly to fit this goal. This is the goal of Christianity right here in 2 verses. Romans chapter 12, Paul mentioned this from the beginning in his prayer this morning. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Do not be conformed, rather be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you can discern, as certainly the Hebrew writer would say in chapter 5, right from wrong, good from evil. And that includes how we speak. And there's a big difference in how we do it. Notice what James says about the tongue in James chapter 3, and we'll draw some application. In James chapter 3, Esther was bold to come before the king, to speak before the king. But I'm not thinking necessarily of the topics we choose, but rather the words we're using to speak with. In James chapter 3, notice in verse 4, beginning in verse 4, look at the ships also. They are so large and are driven by strong winds. They are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things. How great a force is set ablaze by such a small fire. The tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. Certainly we know in Ephesians chapter 4, no profane thing should come from a Christian's mouth. We know in chapter 5, and really even the last verse 32 of chapter 4, we are to be kind and forgiving to one another as God loved us, and Jesus was kind and forgiving to us first. We understand that that's how it should sound, but notice what James says, 3 things. Number 1, the tongue is incredibly powerful, and I would ask, has anyone ever said something that they regret? But I know that answer is yes. If you have spoken, you have said something you regret. I would follow up with, have you ever said something you would give almost anything to take back? And the answer is still probably that same percentage of hands would be up if we're all being honest and awake here on this Sunday morning. The question isn't, can the tongue be destructive? It's how are we harnessing it? And that's really what James is writing about in chapter 3, isn't it? But then he moves on and he explains that the tongue isn't just powerful. Verse 8, no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. And by the way, I have to tell you, as someone who loves loopholes on things, it's great to hear you can't tame it, so good luck. Isn't that encouraging? Sometimes we say things and we just wish we could take it back because of the consequences. And that's what the tongue is. It's not about saying the words, it's about what happens once the words have come out. Our influence has changed. the way someone hears and understands who I am has changed. It can be for better, it could be for worse. Florida had a football coach that we really disliked, and they wanted to get him, and he was just so weird. And he was from Alabama, and he talked like that, and it did not take well in Gainesville, mainly because he wasn't winning. But one day he told this ridiculous story about a shark, and they fired him for it. Because for no reason at all, he veered off in a press conference to tell this lie of a story, and they caught him, and they fired him. And of course, they've been litigating whether or not that's cause or not. But they caught him lying because he told a story that he never needed to get into in the first place. And while Florida fans were happy about that, that whole story is pretty sad, isn't it? Until, unfortunately, I remember I'm the same way. How many times, not only have I said something I wish I didn't in the moment, but how many times have I had a conversational choice? Have I filled my heart with things that then come out of my mouth that I should have never gone down that route to begin with? That's the third argument in James. Notice the end. He says there's only one way the mouth should operate. In verse 10, the same mouth come blessings and cursing, my brothers. These things ought not to be so. You can't be double-minded or, as we would say, double-tongued. Verse 11, does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Rhetorically, no. Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives or a grapevine produce figs? Of course not. Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. We have to choose what we are, and it's beyond just not responding when we're angry, although that's important. We're known by how we speak. People understand when someone is kind. And they know that, first of all, by looking at them. But they know that a lot more when we listen. When someone speaks kindly. And there's all sorts of ways to learn this. They say in dating, for example, a lady should look to see how a boy treats his mom. We say, how does someone not just treat his superiors, but his inferiors? How does someone treat a waiter or a waitress? There's all these things we do. And 99% of that treatment is what? Verbal. And nonverbals matter. They actually do inform a lot of what we take in. But the verbal is important, and this is a problem because James has just made the point that no one can tame the tongue. To boldly be a child of God today is to not only stay away from conversational topics that Christians have no business speaking about, but that we should have no idea even what some of them are. I find it concerning that as a culture, we've drifted so far that we can actually reason with someone about the depth of this profane problem. And I don't just mean going to a movie and hearing profane words and saying them. I mean topically. How does it that salt water comes out of what should be a fresh spigot? Garbage in, garbage out. We should be known by how we speak. We are known by how we speak. The question is, what are you known for if it was just your words? Would it be kindness? Are you a light? Are you a complainer? Are you someone who always finds the one gray cloud in the otherwise sunny sky? And by the way, you all know someone like that, don't you? We do. Don't say their name. That's mean. That's not kind. Right? But you know someone who's like that. And if you don't know someone, by the way, take some stock because the odds are someone's in the room, and if you can't think of them, we need to be speaking with kindness. That means changing the words we use, the topics we think of and put into our hearts. And by the way, the conversations we're standing around. You know what gets people's attention that's even nonverbal? Walking away. And that one's uncomfortable. And as someone who hates any sort of conflict or extra attention in that kind of capacity, I hate to walk away because what does that do? If I walk away and I'm introverted, what fear does that activate? People see the person who moved. They don't see the person standing in the circle. They see the person who said, no, this is not for me, I'm out. But wasn't the right thing for Esther to do to go before the king under threat of death? To the egomaniac who whipped water because it didn't obey him? I think I can walk away from tough conversations if that's what my God requires. I think we need to be a modest person. I think this has all sorts of identities. We think of modest, and it seems so often just conflicted to mean clothing. And that is a capacity of it. But being a modest person is more than just how we dress. It actually encapsulates how we speak. But also, yes, how we dress, and we're going to talk about some of those elements here. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8. 1 Timothy chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. It's fascinating. In 1 Timothy 3 and verse 8, among the first qualifications of a deacon is this weird line, not addicted to much wine. And yet the elders are told to basically not be a drunkard, to have none of that. And so the question is always raised, well, if deacons can drink some wine because they're just not addicted to much of it and elders can't, surely that's an important distinction. Maybe. Maybe. I would encourage you to look at that closer. But these exception clauses stand out. And one thing that's happened with verse 9 and 10 is we say, women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, verse 10, with what is proper for women who profess godliness. Is the takeaway from that that women are the only ones to dress in what we would call modest apparel? I really hope no one thinks that, because that's silly. And my problem is that if you listen to Bible lessons from good men and women on this topic, that's almost all of what's spoken about. Dress, as in clothing, depending on the circumstance. It could be having fun, it could be at the church building, it just depends. And it's often even, by the way, about how a man will look at a woman. And once again, you look at society statistics, lust is a problem that does not discriminate. Does not discriminate across ages, sickeningly so. Does not discriminate across genders. Lust, modesty, Christianity are things we all grapple with on a day-to-day basis. And so verse 9 and 10, though, has to mean something. So what does it mean to have respectable apparel? What does it mean to dress modestly? I think 1 Peter chapter 3 really helps us look there with this. There's a different situation entirely going on in 1 Peter chapter 3. You have a marriage between someone who is a Christian and someone who is a non-Christian. And by the way, just like the stats of 21st century and 20th century America bear out, the Bible in the New Testament seems to fixate on when a woman is married to a non-Christian man. Didn't you know that God managed to see that coming 2,000 years away? That the people who are overwhelmingly more faithful, at least in American Christianity, are women? Chapter 3 and verse 1, what do we do in that circumstance? Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. What is the point of this modesty? It says it very clearly in verse 1. So that the husband who does not obey can be won without a word. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've read that, and heard somebody say out loud what I'm thinking. Good luck. Is that the way we should read the scriptures, though? Should we doubt what God has said to be true? What is the point? The point is, if someone, in this case a woman, carries herself in a certain way, it can and will make an impact on those around us. That almost sounds pretty similar to what we were saying before, isn't it, about Esther and her influence? The way we speak and the way people notice. And that certainly would apply to not only how we dress, but how we see others dressing too. We teach this backwards all the time. Most of the lessons that are taught on modest apparel go to one of two extremes that I truly loathe. One is counting what I'd call seam inches, right? Something's got to be this long, this wide, 3 fingers, 4 fingers. I can't even keep up with what the standards are. And part of the problem is because those standards are made up. When God says to dress in respectable apparel, for women in this case, but men certainly apply as well, it's not about finding the limit. It's about dressing in a way that Jesus would approve of. And so I ask a simple question on this before we get into the backwards teaching. Would you wear what you wear every day around Jesus if he was in our form? And for those of you with Alabama and Auburn closets, good luck with that. You have a lot of purging to do. I don't get to judge what is and what isn't acceptable, what is or isn't pleasing to God, and what is and isn't helping my influence. I can take some guesses at what doesn't because that seems to be easier. But I answer to God for that, for myself and for my household. And you answer to God for yourself and your household. But one of the things that comes up is we rebel because there's been generations that have been taught that you dress so that other people don't stumble. Is that something we should keep in mind? Perhaps. But that's not the Bible picture at all. The Bible picture is always please God. hard stop. Dress to please him, not yourself, not people around, not to make other people not do bad things, to please my maker. Now, subpart. To please God implies what secondarily? That I care about people. But I'm in the soul winning business. Isn't that what's going on in 1 Peter chapter 3? Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. By the way, these who don't obey the word, that they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. In Matthew 18 and verse 15, when your brother sins against you, what are you supposed to do? Go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Why? Because Jesus cares about souls. And if the brother doesn't listen to you, what do you do then? You take 2 or 3 witnesses and you speak to him. Why? Because Jesus cares about souls. One of the things that's happened with modesty, it's been so hijacked into, you should do it for this reason. Well, that's a bad reason. I'm not going to do it, so I'm going to go over here. And you're like, well, that is a bad reason, but can't you be over here and not over there? Because we've missed the idea. Our standard is not anything other than what pleases God. It's not first century fashion, thank goodness. It's not 70s fashion. I've seen your pictures, thank goodness. It's what does God want? And how can I best be a transformed Christian in an otherwise conformed world? What does that look like? It is going to look different. It is going to stand out. That doesn't mean you have to wear the weirdest thing you can find at Target, though. Sometimes the argument is, are you saying I should wear this? No, first of all, don't take my advice on clothing. That's terrible. Ask caution. It's going to be substantially better for everyone involved. But our goal isn't to dress a certain way or to speak a certain way. It's to simply please God, hard stop. Yes, we should care about other people. But rather than just making people not sin, shouldn't we focus rather, by the way, on how I can encourage someone else to be different from the world? I'm afraid that our standards on speech have moved. If you notice, I've always watched movies on TV growing up, and I watch them as adults, and I tell people, you should watch this. This movie's hilarious. And I watch it for about 10 minutes, and I realize, uh-oh, I watch this on TV because, at least when I was growing up, a lot of times on TV, what does the television do that our Blu-rays don't? Streaming doesn't take out the explicit language. I didn't know that, A, because I wasn't paying that close attention, and B, because it was taken out. And so what's happened is over time, though, those ratings that we used to use to decide what I can see and what I can't see have moved. What used to be PG, in some cases, is worse than PG-13 rated R movies I've seen. Does that mean don't see any movies? No, I'm not saying that. But what we have to do is start making the standard what God says. You have to decide what that is. If you have trouble with it, you can talk to the elders about that. You can talk to the deacons. You can talk to somebody who you trust about that. Please do. Get wise counsel. But one of the things that's happened is we judge, we say, well, I'm better than this. And so we as Christians keep the world at arm's length. We say, they're over there, I'm going to boldly stand here. And 15 years pass. The world drifts and we go, I'm keeping the world at arm's length. They're over here and I'm right here. 20 years pass. I'm keeping the world at arm's length. They're over here and I'm right here. What's happened? Satan's laughing his tail off because he's moved the ball. People say things and use words that 30 years ago not just wouldn't be used because they're so small and they're acronyms. They say things that would embarrass people 30 and 40 years ago. Is that because everyone 40 years ago were perfect Christians? No, there was all kinds of sin. By the way, huge revolutions went on in the 70s and 80s that are to begin a lot of the problems that we're reaping from now. But our standard should have never moved in the first place. It was set before the 70s. It was set before the 50s. It was set when Jesus came and spoke. That changes how we speak. It changes how we dress. And it changes why I use the tools of the day. Look with me in Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6, the question isn't, what is the line? What is the limit? It's why am I doing anything that I'm doing? Why am I the way that I am? Why am I taking the action? Why am I using the words? Why am I dressing the way I do? And if the answer is, I don't know, that's not good. Matthew chapter 6, notice with me in verse 3. When you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. And a lot of you said, uh-oh, I was going to pray at the lunch table. That's not what he's talking about. We need to be bold. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16 says, be a light in the dark world that others may see your good works, which means you can't be behind the door all the time, and give glory to your God who is in heaven. All right, so how do we break this tie? The tie says, don't do good works before men, but also do your good works so that people can see your God through you. That's kind of a dilemma, isn't it? I think social media is a good test case. The question is, why do I use it? Why do I post what I do? Why do I read what I do? Why do I follow what I follow? If it's because I'm bored, look out. There's a lot of danger there. If it's because I want attention, look out. That is what's being spoken about in verse 3 through 6. Look at me. If that's not me, great. You can use social media for God's glory. And by the way, you can use social media for God's glory without posting sermons. Right? Sometimes there's this idea that, okay, if I'm going to do something, I have to literally be posting Bible verses or nothing. That's not biblical at all. We are real people who live in the real world. We have to use real words, dress in real ways, and have real social media accounts. What does that mean? Think about why I'm doing what I am. If someone just looked at how I speak for a day, would they think I'm a child of God? If they saw how I dressed for a day, would they think I'm a child of God? If they looked at my social media page, would they think I'm a child of God? My job is to boldly do what's right regardless of what anyone else thinks about it, because I'm the only one who's going to answer for being me. Does that mean people will disagree with me? You bet they will. Does that mean the world will hate me? Sometimes. Does that mean Christians will judge me? I hope not, but probably. Our job isn't to please Christians, it's to please God. Our job isn't to please the world, certainly. It's to be transformed by the renewal of our mind. We are to boldly be different. So how do we do that? How do we be these lights in the world of darkness without being in an attention-seeking way? I need to stop and think. I need to, as Haggai would say, consider my ways. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? What is my motivation? And if it's impure, stop it. And if it's pure, enjoy. If it's righteous and good, fantastic. Sometimes people say, well, I do it for this reason. You don't have to explain yourself. Just have a reason. Don't let the reason be nothing, because if it's nothing, Satan will be glad to give you a something. Have a reason. Notice 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Look with me there. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 1. I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when I am away. I beg of you that when I am present, that I may not have to show boldness with such confidence, as I count on showing against them who suspect us of walking according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but of divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. We need to think through what we're doing. We need to take every thought captive. One of the things that Kasia got completely wrong about me, and that list is long, when we first started meeting, was she thought that I was incredibly spontaneous. And that just is ridiculous. But the reason she thought that is because of the first 7 or 8 dates that we went on, I had all sorts of plans and contingency plans for if we took this long at dinner, we would go do this next. If we took this long at dessert, we would go do this next. And so I seemed flexible because I was always ready to do something else. And she thought, wow, that's incredibly flexible. And then she got married to me, and then the conversation when we go somewhere is, okay, so when we do this, are we going to go with plan A, B, C, D, E, or F afterwards? And she said, I thought you were spontaneous. I said, this is me being spontaneous. I am planning my spontaneity. We need to think through what we're doing. Why am I the way that I am? You know, one thing we always wonder is, why isn't the church growing the way we wish it was? Why isn't Christianity more impactful? Or we throw stones and we say, we know that the church isn't growing because of this. You know why we can say that? Because we're thinking about it. Because we think there are these flaws and these arguments, and so we want to be better. The question isn't just how to not be bad or to be really good. The question is, how do I please God in what I'm doing every day? How would a Christian use the computer? How would a Christian use their cell phones? How would a Christian attend services? We have to think about that and be prepared in advance. I need to help others see God. I need to realize this is my calling. Remember Mordecai's argument to Esther? Look, God can send anyone else. Deliverance will rise for the Jews. It doesn't have to be from you. But if you don't want you and your father's house to perish, we need you now. The time for you to step up and to save your family is now. Barnabas is considered the son of encouragement, so much so that he's named after the encouragement he gives. And we got to think the way I am, the way people hear me, see me, and interact with me, and see me doing from a good works perspective, that makes an impact. And when I say, well, I have rights and it's not a big deal, it may not be a big deal, and I may have that right. But the question is, am I influencing someone else to sit on the sidelines? Is me not taking action that's not mandatory helping someone else not step up and help someone in need? Because that's a problem. We need to help others see God and get closer to him, not develop their rights. Christians don't exist to figure out what we can and can't do and get away with. We exist to give glory to our Maker. That's God. And the way I act absolutely impacts others. And so really it comes down to this in 1 Peter 4. We need to stop being like the world. And notice what the world will do when this happens. You need to know, am I taking every thought captive? Am I considering my ways? Am I being effective to the people in darkness around me? Here's a good way to tell. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 1. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. For whoever suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. The time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. Verse 4, they are surprised, and when they get over that, what do? They malign you. If there aren't people who are surprised and maligning me, it's not a guarantee, but isn't at least a yellow flag that maybe I'm not different enough from a world I'm supposed to be entirely different from? Isn't it weird that as Christians we have blended in so well to a society that we say has so far left God? It's strange. The idea that I can keep one foot in this world and one foot out while standing in this church building talking about how bad the world is not just bizarre, it's wrong. Can't do it. And the world will notice this first. They'll notice hypocrisy and they'll call it out. They'll see good works and be moved by it. They'll be surprised when we don't go along and they will malign you. The bottom line is, how do I be a light in a world of darkness? I have to obsess over one thing, and it's not the football score, it's not the baseball game, it's not the lack of pitching that Florida had that cost them the College World Series, which surely doesn't matter. It is pleasing God. In Philippians chapter 1, look with me there. Philippians chapter 1. Notice Paul's attitude. It just pops off the page, his perspective. If we have this, we're going to be golden. For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you, that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. Live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. I desire to be with God, but I'm hard-pressed because I want to help you. Our attitude is so obvious. It's through our words. It's the way we look. It's the way we act. It's everything about us. We're not saying that everything needs to be anti the world. We're saying everything needs to be like God. And when the world's different than God, so be it. And what the world has gotten right, which is very little, but when it's right because God said so, not because the world thinks so. The only question is, will I please God or everybody else? And a lot of times, here's some bad news, and I'm just going to be really honest. Christians are unhappy in their life. There's a lot of Christian people who are unhappy because they're living with one foot in both worlds, and that won't work. It won't please God. It won't fit in with the world. You are far better off just walking away and seeing what you've missed than trying to be lukewarm. God talks about those people in Revelation 3. He spews them from his mouth. Choose God's side. Choose life. Live a life worthy of the gospel. If you've never become a Christian, that life is possible. You don't have to stay like everyone else. You can be saved. You can be adopted in the family of God, believing that Jesus is the Christ, confessing him as Lord, repenting of your sins, and being baptized. You can have your sins completely washed away and become very clearly both feet in the camp and family of God. Or maybe you are a Christian and you realize, like me, you've struggled with that one foot in, that one foot out. That's wrong. But you know what's right is that God is patient. He is gracious and willing to forgive. He asks us in 1 John 1 to confess our sins to him and he will forgive us. And this family here is here to help you because we've been there. We will pray with you because it's powerful, because God says so. Please God, don't please man. If we can help you at all, be right with